Good evening, friends, and welcome back to another peaceful journey through history's quieter corners. Tonight, we'll drift into the marble-columned world of ancient Greece, where brilliant minds pondered life's biggest questions under starlit Mediterranean skies. I'm your gentle guide through these timeless stories of wisdom and wonder. Take a moment now to dim your lights. Perhaps light a soft candle if you have one nearby. Pull that cozy blanket up to your chin and let your body sink deep into your mattress. Tonight's destination is the ancient Agora of Athens, where philosophers once strolled through olive groves, their sandals whispering against worn stone paths. Before we begin our quiet exploration, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the globe? Are you settling in after a long day, or perhaps stealing a moment of calm in the early hours? Drop a gentle note in the comments below. And if this peaceful journey helps you unwind and drift toward sleep, a soft tap on the like button and subscribe would mean the world to me only if it feels right in your heart. Let the soft Mediterranean breeze carry us back 25 centuries, where wisdom flowed like honey from golden amphora, and every question led to 3 more beautiful mysteries. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let's wander together through these ancient gardens of thought. Let me tell you about a man who changed the world by simply looking up at the stars and asking why. Picture this. It's the year 585 BCE, and in the bustling port city of Miletus, where merchant ships bobbed gently in the harbor like sleeping seagulls, there lived a curious soul named Thales. Imagine him now, weathered face creased from years of contemplation, scent of seaweed, and the warm aroma of fresh bread from nearby bakeries. Olive oil lamps flickered in windows as the evening approached, casting dancing shadows on whitewashed walls. And there was Thales, perhaps sitting on a simple wooden stool outside his modest home, gazing upward with the wonder of a child and the wisdom of ages. You see, before Thales came along, people explained the mysteries of existence through stories of gods and monsters, of Zeus hurling lightning bolts and Poseidon stirring the seas with his mighty trident. But Thales, this gentle revolutionary, suggested something wonderfully radical, yet beautifully simple. What if, he whispered to anyone who would listen, what if everything, absolutely everything, came from water? Close your eyes and imagine this for a moment. Think of water in all its forms, the morning dew that kisses rose petals, the babbling brook that sings lullabies to smooth river stones, the vast ocean that cradles sleeping whales. Thales observed how water could become vapor, rising like invisible spirits toward the heavens, then condense into clouds that would gift the earth with life-giving rain. He watched ice melt into streams, and streams flow into rivers, and rivers empty into the eternal sea in the soft twilight of ancient Miletus. As merchants closed their shops and children played their final games before bedtime, Thales would walk slowly through the marketplace. His sandals made a gentle shuffling sound against the worn stones, polished smooth by countless feet over countless years. The evening air was perfumed with jasmine and the lingering smoke from cooking fires, where families prepared their simple suppers of olives, cheese, and wine. Everything is full of gods, Thales would murmur to himself, but not in the way his neighbors understood gods. To him, The divine wasn't sitting atop Mount Olympus, throwing tantrums and playing favorites with mortals. No, the sacred lived in every droplet, every stream, every cloud. The universe itself was alive, breathing, thinking, feeling. Picture Thales on that famous day when he predicted a solar eclipse, May 28th, 585 BCE, to be precise. Imagine the bustling preparation as word spread through the Greek territories like ripples across a still pond. People gathered in the agora, some fearful, others curious, all waiting to see if this gentle philosopher's calculations would prove true as the morning sun began its daily journey across the cloudless sky. Families spread woolen blankets on hillsides. Children clutched their parents' hands, while vendors sold sweet honey cakes and cups of watered wine. The air buzzed with nervous excitement, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm when you can feel electricity dancing on your skin. And then, slowly, majestically, the moon began its celestial dance across the face of the sun. The bright Mediterranean day grew dim, then dimmer, as if the gods themselves were gently closing their eyes for an afternoon nap. Birds returned to their nests, confused by this sudden twilight. Temperature dropped just enough to make people pull their chitons closer around their shoulders in those mystical moments of totality. When day became night and night became wonder, Thales stood quietly among the awed crowd. No boasting, no grand proclamations, just a gentle smile creasing his weathered face as he watched his mathematical predictions unfold in the cosmic theater above. The eclipse lasted perhaps 6 minutes, but in those minutes the world changed forever. Here was proof that the universe followed patterns, rules, natural laws that human minds could understand and predict. But let me share with you the most endearing thing about Thales's legendary absent-mindedness. The story goes that one evening, so absorbed was he in contemplating the stars that he tumbled right into a well. A servant girl, probably no more than 16, helped pull him out, water dripping from his beard and chiton. With a laugh as light as spring rain, she teased him. How can you expect to understand what's happening in the heavens when you can't even see what's at your own feet? Oh, how this story has echoed through the centuries, like a gentle bell tolling across peaceful valleys. It captures something beautifully human about our first philosopher, that deep thinkers sometimes forget the mundane world around them, so captivated are they by grander mysteries. Picture that scene, the cool night air carrying the scent of wild thyme, crickets chirping their eternal songs, and there's Thales, dripping wet but laughing, his eyes still fixed on the celestial patterns overhead. When the rest of Miletus slept soundly in their beds, Thales would often sit by the harbor, watching the gentle waves lap against the wooden piers. The water caught fragments of moonlight and scattered them like liquid silver coins. Here, in these peaceful moments, he pondered the fundamental question that would occupy philosophers for millennia. What is the basic stuff of reality? His answer, water, might seem almost childishly simple to us now, but imagine the revolutionary courage it took to suggest that everything, from the hardest stone to the softest cloud, from the mightiest mountain to the tiniest grain of sand, all shared the same essential nature. In a world where different gods were believed to rule different realms, Thales proposed a universe of beautiful unity. Think of it this way. Thales was like someone today suggesting that both a butterfly's wing and a distant galaxy are made of the same fundamental particles. Except he proposed this idea without microscopes or telescopes, without laboratories or libraries of scientific knowledge. He used only his eyes, his reason, and his intuition tools available to any human being willing to look closely at the world. The merchants of Miletus, busy with their olive oil and pottery trades, probably thought Thales was a harmless eccentric. Here was a man who could predict eclipses but couldn't navigate a simple evening walk without falling into wells. Yet these same merchants unknowingly benefited from his practical wisdom. Thales used his understanding of weather patterns and seasonal changes to corner the olive oil market one profitable year, proving that philosophical thinking could yield very earthly rewards. As night deepened over ancient Miletus, and the last fishing boats returned with their silver catches glinting in the moonlight, Thales would retire to his simple home. Perhaps he'd light an oil lamp and make notes on a wax tablet, recording his observations in simple, elegant Greek script. The soft light would illuminate his thoughtful face as he pondered questions that still keep philosophers awake at night. Why does anything exist at all? What connects all things? How can human reason unlock the secrets of the cosmos? Outside his window, the Mediterranean night sang its eternal lullaby, waves whispering against the shore, gentle wind rustling through olive branches, the distant call of night birds over the water. In this peaceful soundscape, humanity's first recorded philosopher drifted towards sleep, his mind still dancing with wonder at the beautiful complexity of existence. And here's what makes Thales so endlessly endearing. He didn't claim to have all the answers. He simply had the courage to ask better questions. Instead of accepting because the gods willed it as an explanation for natural phenomena, he gently suggested that the universe might be far more beautiful and orderly than anyone had dared imagine. He planted the first seeds in the garden of human curiosity that would bloom into science, mathematics, and all the systematic ways we now explore reality as we leave Thales there in his lamplit study, surrounded by the soft sounds of sleeping Miletus. Let your own mind wander like moonlight on water. Feel the same sense of wonder that kept him awake on countless nights, marveling at the intricate patterns woven through existence. And perhaps, like that first philosopher by the ancient harbor, you too might discover something beautiful in the gentle rhythm of questions that lead to more questions, each one opening like a flower toward the light of understanding. Now, let your thoughts drift like incense smoke from bustling Miletus to the sun-drenched island of Samos, where, around 570 BCE, a child was born who would hear mathematics singing in the morning breeze. Pythagoras 7, his name sounds like a gentle equation, doesn't it? Py-Thag-O-ras, each syllable as measured and harmonious as the musical scales he would later discover, hidden in the fabric of reality itself. Picture the ancient Mediterranean morning when young Pythagoras first noticed something magical. Perhaps he was walking along the harbor, sandals slapping softly against sun-warmed stones, when he heard a blacksmith working in his forge. The rhythmic ring of hammer against anvil created a melody that made the boy stop in his tracks, tilting his head like a curious sparrow. But it wasn't just the rhythm that captivated him, it was the way different hammers produced different pitches, as if the metal itself was singing in precise mathematical relationships. The air around the forge shimmered with heat waves, carrying the scent of hot iron and the smith's honest sweat. Wood smoke from nearby cooking fires mingled with the salt breeze from the harbor, creating an atmosphere as rich and layered as the philosophical insights young Pythagoras was already beginning to form. He would return to that forge again and again, listening with the intensity of a musician tuning a lyre, slowly unraveling the numerical secrets hidden in everyday sounds. In those days, when the known world was small enough that a curious mind could hope to understand all of it, Pythagoras embarked on what we might call the ultimate ancient study abroad program. Imagine him as a young man, perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes and the kind of eager energy that makes people lean forward when you speak. He traveled first to Egypt, that land of pyramids and mysteries, where priest mathematicians had been calculating the flooding of the Nile for thousands of years. The journey to Egypt would have taken weeks aboard a merchant vessel, the kind of ship that carried amphorae of olive oil and wine between the scattered islands of the Mediterranean. Picture Pythagoras on deck during those long nights at sea, wrapped in a woolen cloak against the cool ocean air, gazing up at stars that seemed close enough to pluck like grapes from heaven's vineyard. The gentle rocking of the ship, the soft slap of waves against the hull, the creak of rope and timbrel of it would have spoken to him in mathematical rhythms. In Egypt, among temples whose massive stones were fitted together with a precision that still amazes us today, Pythagoras encountered geometry not as abstract theory but as living, breathing tool for creating beauty. The priests showed him how right triangles could be used to resurvey fields after the Nile's annual flooding, how the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter was the same, whether you were measuring a temple column or a potter's wheel. But Egypt was only the beginning. From there, our wandering philosopher journeyed east to Babylon, that great city of hanging gardens and star-studying astronomers. The travel would have been arduous weeks of walking or riding along dusty caravan routes, sleeping under stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. In Babylon, Pythagoras encountered mathematical traditions even older than Egypt's. Astronomers who had been tracking planetary motions for over 1,000 years, recording their observations on clay tablets in cuneiform script that looked like tiny bird footprints in mud. Imagine Pythagoras in a Babylonian temple courtyard at twilight, the air still warm from the day's heat but beginning to cool as the first stars appeared around him. Priest astronomers prepared their instruments, simple but ingenious devices for measuring celestial angles and recording the positions of wandering stars. The soft murmur of their calculations mixed with the distant sounds of the city settling into, evening merchants closing their stalls, families gathering for supper, children playing their last games before bedtime. It was here, in this confluence of Egyptian geometry and Babylonian astronomy, that Pythagoras began to perceive something extraordinary. The universe itself seemed to be constructed according to mathematical principles, not just practical things like surveying and calendars, but everything: the way flower petals arranged themselves, the proportions of seashells, the intervals between musical notes that sounded harmonious to the human ear. When Pythagoras finally returned to the Greek world after decades of study, he was like a traveler returning from a distant land with pockets full of precious gems. But instead of gold and silver, he carried mathematical insights that would reshape how humans understood reality itself. He established his famous school in Croton, a Greek colony in southern Italy, where the Mediterranean climate created perfect conditions for contemplation. The school wasn't like our modern institutions with rigid curricula and lecture halls. Instead, imagine a villa surrounded by gardens, where olive trees cast dappled shadows on pathways lined with rosemary and thyme. Students, both men and women, which was remarkably progressive, for the time would gather in these peaceful settings to explore the hidden harmonies underlying existence. The Pythagoreans, as they came to be called, lived according to principles that might seem charmingly eccentric today. They avoided eating beans not from any dietary wisdom we'd recognize, but because Pythagoras believed beans contained human souls in various stages of reincarnation. Picture the gentle confusion of dinner guests when offered a bowl of perfectly good legumes, only to have their Pythagorean host politely decline with a mysterious smile and a wave of the hand. But here's where Pythagoras becomes truly magical. He discovered that musical harmony follows precise mathematical relationships. Take a string on a lyre and pluck it produces a certain tone. Press the string exactly halfway along its length and pluck again, and you'll hear the same note but an octave higher. The ratio is exactly 2:1. Press it 1/3 of the way along, and you get a perfect fifth ratio of 3:2. Imagine Pythagoras in his garden study as the Mediterranean sun set behind cypress trees, casting long purple shadows across his workspace. He would have had various lyres and simple stringed instruments arranged on wooden tables, along with wax tablets covered in calculations. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of waves against the rocky coastline. As he plucked different strings and adjusted their lengths, he was literally listening to mathematics make music. This discovery led to one of the most beautiful ideas in all of human thought, the music of the spheres. Pythagoras proposed that the planets themselves, as they moved through their celestial orbits, created a cosmic symphony based on the same mathematical ratios he'd found in earthly music. The moon hummed one note, Mars another, Jupiter a deep bass tone that resonated through the cosmic concert hall. Of course, we don't hear this celestial musical according to Pythagoras. We've been listening to it since birth, so our ears have become accustomed to its constant presence, like people who live near waterfalls and no longer notice the sound. But sometimes, in moments of deep quiet, when you're lying in bed and the world seems hushed and peaceful, perhaps you can almost sense that grand cosmic harmony humming just below the threshold of hearing. The most famous discovery bearing Pythagoras's name, the theorem about right triangles, might seem abstract at first glance. But think of it this way: every time ancient builders wanted to create a perfect right angle for a temple or house, they could use Pythagoras's insight. Take a rope and mark it off in lengths of 3, 4, and 5 units. Form a triangle with these measurements, and you'll always get a perfect right angle. It's like having a mathematical carpenter's square that never fails. Picture master builders in ancient Croton using this technique. their weathered hands holding ropes marked with knots, their experienced eyes checking and rechecking angles as temples rose stone by stone toward the sky. The mathematical principle ensured that walls would be truly vertical, that roofs would bear their weight properly, that the building would stand for centuries. In this way, abstract mathematical truth became as practical and necessary as bread and olive oil. In the evenings, after a day of teaching and contemplation, Pythagoras would often walk alone through his garden as crickets began their nightly chorus. The mathematical ratios he'd discovered in music seemed to echo in everything around: hymns, the spiral patterns of seashells, the geometric arrangement of flower petals, the proportional relationships between different parts of the human body. Reality itself appeared to be constructed according to numerical harmony. The Pythagorean community developed its own gentle rhythms and rituals. Mornings began with periods of silent reflection, students sitting quietly in the garden as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Days were divided between mathematical study, musical practice, and philosophical discussion. Evenings concluded with communal meals where conversation flowed as freely as the local wine, covering topics from the geometry of triangles to the nature of the human soul. What made Pythagoras so enduringly fascinating was his conviction that mathematics wasn't just a tool for practical problems, but a window into the deepest nature of reality. Numbers, in his vision, weren't mere human inventions, but fundamental aspects of existence itself. When we discover mathematical truths, we're not creating them, we're uncovering eternal principles that have always existed, waiting patiently like buried treasures for human minds, capable of recognizing their beauty. As moonlight streams through your window tonight, casting geometric shadows across your room, let yourself feel the same wonder that kept Pythagoras awake on countless Mediterranean evenings, in the regular patterns of light and darkness, in the rhythmic sound of your own breathing, in the mathematical precision with which your heart beats its steady tempo. The same numerical harmonies still echo through existence, singing their ancient songs of order and beauty. Let your mind drift now like morning mist through the narrow streets of Athens, to a time when the Parthenon still gleamed with fresh marble, and the agora bustled with citizens debating everything under the Mediterranean sun. Here, around 470 BCE, was born perhaps the most paradoxical figure in all of Philosophia, man who claimed to know nothing, yet taught everything, who wrote not a single word, yet influenced every thinker who came after him. Socrates, even saying his name, evokes something wonderfully contradictory, doesn't it? Socrates. He was described by his contemporaries as resembling a satyr, one of those mythological creatures with the face of a wise old goat and eyes that twinkled with mischief. Picture him, short and stocky, with a snub nose that had clearly been broken in his younger days as a soldier, a prominent forehead that seemed to bulge with all the questions stored inside, and a beard that he probably forgot to trim because he was too busy pondering the nature of justice or beauty or friendship. Imagine encountering Socrates on a typical morning in the Athenian agora. The marketplace would already be alive with activity vendors arranging pyramids of olives in wooden bowls, bakers pulling fresh loaves from clay ovens, their crusts golden and crackling in the warm morning air. The scent of fresh bread mingled with the earthier aromas of leather goods and the metallic temps of bronze work from the smith's quarter. Somewhere, a potter's wheel hummed its ancient rhythm, while birds chattered in the plane trees that provided blessed shade from the increasingly warm sun. And there, in the middle of all this commercial bustle, would be Socrates in his simple chiton, probably the same one he'd worn for weeks, because worldly concerns, like fashion, held little interest for him. He'd be engaged in animated conversation with someone, perhaps a young aristocrat flush with inherited wealth and inherited opinions, or maybe a respected elder convinced of his own wisdom. Socrates would listen with the intense focus of a musician tuning his lyre, his head tilted slightly, eyes bright with curiosity, and just a hint of playful mischief. You see, Socrates had developed what we might call the most politely devastating technique in the history of human conversation. He would approach someone who was considered an experter politician, who spoke confidently about justice, a priest who claimed deep knowledge of piety, a general who boasted of understanding courage, and Socrates would begin asking questions, not aggressive, confrontational questions, but gentle, genuinely curious inquiries that seemed almost innocent. "Tell me," he might say to a wealthy merchant known for his success, "you've mentioned that you're a just man. That's wonderful. I've always wanted to understand justice better. Could you help me? What exactly is justice?" The merchant would probably puff up with pride, delighted to share his wisdom with this curious old philosopher. "Justice," he might declare, "is giving each person what they deserve." "Ah," Socrates would nod thoughtfully, his eyes lighting up with apparent delight. "That's fascinating. But help me understand, what do you mean by what they deserve? If my friend loans me his sword, and I promise to return it, but then he goes mad and demands it back so he can harm someone, should I return it because that's what he deserves? Or would justice require me to keep it to prevent harm?" And suddenly, like a gentle earthquake that shifts the foundations of a building, the merchant's confident definition would begin to wobble. The conversation would continue, each question revealing new complexities, new contradictions, until both men would find themselves in that strange and wonderful territory that Socrates loved best, the recognition of their own ignorance. Picture these conversations happening throughout Athens on any given day, in the gymnasium where young men exercised and discussed politics, their bronzed bodies glistening with olive oil as they wrestled or threw the discus, in the shaded colonnades where citizens gathered to escape the afternoon heat, the cool marble providing relief while their minds grappled with increasingly complex questions, in symposiums held in wealthy homes where wine flowed freely and conversation ranged from the practical to the profound. Socrates had a way of making people uncomfortable in the most delightful way possible. He was like a physician who could diagnose intellectual fever simply by taking the pulse of someone's certainties. The treatment he prescribed was always the same, a healthy dose of self-examination, administered through carefully crafted questions that revealed the patient's assumptions to be far more fragile than they'd imagined. What made this particularly maddening and particularly effective was Socrates' genuine humility about his own knowledge. He wasn't playing some clever game to make others look foolish. He truly believed that he knew nothing of importance, and he was genuinely curious to learn from anyone who might possess real wisdom. When the oracle at Delphi proclaimed him the wisest man in Athens, Socrates was baffled. He set out to prove the oracle wrong by finding someone wiser than himself. This quest led him on a tour of Athenian society that would make a wonderful travel guide to the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. He questioned politicians who spoke eloquently about governance but couldn't define what they meant by good leadership. He interviewed poets who created beautiful verses but couldn't explain what made their work beautiful. He consulted craftsmen who were skilled at their trades but assumed their technical expertise made them wise about everything else. Imagine Socrates in a pottery workshop on one of these investigative missions. The space would be filled with the earthy smell of clay and the warm glow from the kiln. The master potter, his hands stained with clay and his apron dusted with dried earth, would demonstrate his skill centering the clay on the wheel, coaxing it into elegant shapes with movements as graceful as a dancer's. His expertise was undeniable. He could create vessels of perfect proportion and lasting beauty. But when Socrates began asking about beauty itself, what made one pot more beautiful than another, whether beauty existed independently of human perception, how the potter knew when he had achieved true aesthetic success, the conversation would drift into deeper waters. The potter might realize that while he could create beauty, he couldn't fully explain what beauty was. And Socrates, delighted to find a kindred spirit in the recognition of ignorance, would leave the workshop enriched by the encounter. This is what made Socrates so revolutionary and ultimately so dangerous to the established order of Athenian society. In a culture that valued confident rhetoric and established authority, he went around demonstrating that most confident assertions were built on very shaky foundations indeed. He was like a child who keeps asking why, until adults realize they don't actually understand things they thought were obvious. But Socrates wasn't trying to tear down society or promote cynicism. Quite the opposite. He believed that the recognition of ignorance was the beginning of true wisdom. Only when you realized how little you actually knew could you begin the real work of learning. Only when you stopped pretending to understand justice or beauty or courage could you begin the lifelong journey of actually understanding these profound concepts. Picture Socrates in his final months, after he'd been charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing new gods. The trial took place in a large court with hundreds of citizens serving as jurors. The accusations were serious, but they stemmed largely from the fact that Socrates had spent decades making important people uncomfortable by exposing the limitations of their knowledge. Standing before this crowd of his fellow citizens, Socrates could have begged for mercy, could have promised to stop his philosophical questioning, could have fled Athens to live quietly elsewhere. Instead, he used his defense speech as one final opportunity to practice his craft. He questioned the very nature of the charges against him, examined the assumptions underlying Athenian law and custom, and gently suggested that perhaps his accusers didn't fully understand what they were, condemning that the irony was exquisite and heartbreaking. A man whose entire life had been devoted to the pursuit of wisdom through the recognition of ignorance was being executed by people who were certain they understood justice, piety, and the proper education of youth. It was like condemning a doctor for making patients aware of their illness, or punishing a teacher for helping students realize how much more there was to learn. On his final evening, surrounded by friends in his prison cell, Socrates spent his last hours doing what he'd always done, asking questions, examining ideas, pursuing wisdom through dialogue. The prison cell would have been simple, lit by flickering oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. Outside, Athens continued, its familiar rhythms, merchants closing their shops, families gathering for evening meals, children playing in narrow streets that would soon echo with the night sounds of the ancient city. But inside that cell, something timeless was happening. Friends wept at the thought of losing their beloved teacher, but Socrates remained curious about death itself. What was it, exactly? If the soul survived bodily death, what might that existence be like? If consciousness simply ended, would that necessarily be a bad thing? Even facing his own mortality, he couldn't resist examining his assumptions and inviting others to do the same as we leave Socrates there in that lamplit cell, still questioning, still learning, still demonstrating that the wisest response to the mysteries of existence might be a kind of beautiful, humble ignorance. Let his example settle gently over your thoughts like a soft woolen blanket. In our age of instant information and confident opinions, there's something deeply restful about embracing the Socratic recognition that the more we learn, the more we discover how much we don't yet understand. Perhaps tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might find comfort in questions rather than answers, in curiosity rather than certainty. Like Socrates in his endless conversations under the Athenian sun, you might discover that not knowing can be the most peaceful and productive state of mind of all. From the narrow streets and bustling agora of Athens, let your thoughts drift like olive leaves on a gentle breeze to a grove of sacred trees just outside the city walls. Here, around 387 BC, a man who had once harbored dreams of becoming a playwright established something that would outlast any drama ever performed on the Athenian, staged the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, a place called the Academy. His birth name was Aristotle, but everyone called him Platon Broad, probably because of his wrestler's physique from his youth. We know him as Plato, and if you could have encountered him on one of those Mediterranean mornings when the air itself seemed to sparkle with possibility, you would have met a man whose physical presence matched the breadth of his intellectual ambitions. Picture him, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of dignified bearing that came from aristocratic birth, but eyes that held depths of sadness earned through profound loss. You see, Plato had witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his days, to execution of his beloved teacher, Socrates. Imagine the young man's anguish as he watched Athenian democracy condemn the wisest person he'd ever known. The very political system that was supposed to represent the will of the people had been manipulated into destroying the one individual who had devoted his life to helping people think more clearly about justice and virtue and truth. The grove where Plato established his academy was already sacred to the hero Academus, a place where ancient olive trees created natural lecture halls with their spreading branches. Morning light filtered through leaves in patterns that shifted like thoughts taking shape, while the gentle murmur of a nearby stream provided a constant, soothing soundtrack for contemplation. The air carried the resinous scent of pine and the honey-sweet fragrance of wildflowers that bloomed in abundance each spring. But the academy wasn't just a school, it was Plato's answer to a profound question that had been troubling him since Socrates' death. How can we create a society where wisdom is valued more than mere popular opinion? How can we ensure that important decisions are made by people who actually understand justice, rather than by those who simply speak most persuasively about it? Imagine arriving at the academy as a new student, perhaps a young person of 18 or 20, eager to understand the deeper mysteries of existence. You would have walked along dusty paths lined with cypress trees, their dark green spires reaching toward the impossibly blue Athenian sky. The entrance bore an inscription that would have made you pause. "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This wasn't academic snobbery. Plato believed that mathematics was the perfect training for philosophical thinking because it taught the mind to work with eternal, unchanging truths. Inside the grove, you would have found an extraordinary community of seekers. Students came from all over the Greek world and beyond, drawn by Plato's reputation and the academy's unique approach to education. There were no lecture halls in our modern sense, no rigid curricula or standardized tests. Instead, learning happened through dialogue, the same method Socrates had used in the agora, but now refined and systematized into a powerful tool for uncovering truth. Picture a typical morning session under the spreading branches of an ancient olive tree. The teacher, perhaps Plato himself, or one of his advanced students, would pose a question: "What is beauty?" The discussion that followed might last for hours, with participants examining their assumptions, testing definitions against counterexamples, slowly working their way toward deeper understanding. But here's what made Plato's approach so revolutionary. He wasn't content to simply ask questions like Socrates. He wanted to provide answers, or at least, he wanted to explain why finding certain kinds of answers was so difficult. This led him to develop one of the most beautiful and influential theories in all of human thought, the theory of forms. Imagine Plato trying to explain this theory to a group of students gathered in the academy's garden as the afternoon sun slanted through the olive leaves. He might have begun with something simple and concrete. "Look around you," he'd say, gesturing to the flowers blooming in abundance around the grove. "You see roses, violets, jasmine, many different flowers, but somehow you recognize them all as beautiful. What makes them beautiful?" The students might offer various answers: the colors, the proportions, the fragrance, the symmetry. But Plato would gently lead them deeper. If beauty depends on color, why do we find both red roses and white lilies beautiful? If it's about proportions, why do we see beauty in both tiny wildflowers and massive oak trees? Gradually, the students would begin to see that they were using some standard of beauty itself to judge individual beautiful things. This was Plato's great insight. Beyond our physical world of changing, imperfect objects, there exists a realm of perfect forms, unchanging standards, like beauty itself, justice itself, truth itself. Every beautiful thing we see in this world is beautiful only because it participates in or resembles the form of beauty. Every just action is just only because it reflects the eternal form of justice. To help his students understand this revolutionary idea, Plato developed what might be the most famous thought experiment in philosophy, the allegory of the cave. Picture him on an evening when the academy's students had gathered for one of their regular symposiums. Oil lamps flickered in the gathering darkness, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the colonnade where they met. The air was filled with the scent of pine resin and the distant sound of night birds calling from the sacred grove. "Imagine," Plato began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a master storyteller, "a group of people who have been chained in a cave since birth. They're facing a wall, unable to turn their heads. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects back and forth: statues, vessels, tools of various kinds." The students would lean forward, drawn into this strange scenario. They could almost see it: the dark cave, the flickering firelight, the mysterious shadows moving across the stone wall. "The prisoners can see only the shadows cast by these objects," Plato continued. "They've never seen the actual objects themselves, let alone the fire that illuminates them, or the world outside the cave. To them, these shadows are reality itself." But then Plato introduced a twist that would change everything. Now imagine one prisoner breaks free from his chains. He turns around and sees the fire, the objects casting shadows, the true source of what he had thought was reality. At first, the light hurts his eyes. He's confused, disoriented. The shadows he had taken for truth now seem pale and insubstantial compared to these real objects. The students could imagine the freed prisoner's amazement and confusion. Everything he had believed about reality would be called into question. But Plato wasn't finished with his story. The escaped prisoner makes his way out of the cave entirely. He emerges into sunlight and sees the world as it truly is: trees, mountains, the sky itself, all illuminated by the sun. At first, the brightness is overwhelming, but gradually his eyes adjust, and he sees reality in its full glory. In this beautiful allegory, Plato was describing the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge. The shadows on the cave wall represent the imperfect, changing world we experience through our senses. The objects casting the shadows represent the eternal forms. The sun itself represents the form of the good, the highest form that illuminates all others and makes knowledge possible. But here's the heartbreaking part of Plato's story. When the escaped prisoner returns to the cave to share his discoveries, the other prisoners don't believe him. They think his eyes have been damaged by his journey. They prefer their familiar shadows to his strange tales of a brighter world beyond their prison. And if he persists in trying to free them, they might even become violent in their resistance to enlightenment. Sitting in that lamplit colonnade, surrounded by students who had traveled hundreds of miles to seek wisdom, Plato was clearly thinking about his beloved teacher, Socrates. Like the escaped prisoner, Socrates had tried to show his fellow Athenians that their confident opinions were mere shadows of true knowledge. And like the prisoners in the cave, they had responded by silencing the messenger rather than examining his message. But the academy represented Plato's hope that philosophy could create better outcomes. Here, in this grove of sacred trees, students learned to love wisdom more than mere opinion, to value truth more than social convention, to seek the eternal forms rather than contenting themselves with shadows. The education they received wasn't just intellectual, it was moral and spiritual training designed to produce philosopher kings who could guide society toward justice and truth. The daily rhythm of academy life reflected these deeper purposes. Mornings began with mathematical studies, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy that trained the mind to work with unchanging truths. Afternoons were devoted to dialectic, the art of philosophical dialogue that Socrates had perfected. Evenings, often, featured symposiums where students and teachers gathered to explore questions of ethics, politics, and metaphysics. Picture one of these evening gatherings as summer turned to autumn and the olive trees began to drop their fruit. The air would be filled with the sweet scent of fermenting olives and the smoke from cooking fires. Students reclined on simple couches, sharing cups of wine mixed with water according to Greek custom. The conversation might begin with a question about courage in battle and gradually evolve into an exploration of whether virtue could be taught, whether the soul was immortal, whether justice was better than injustice, even when no one was watching. What made these discussions so powerful was their combination of rigorous logic and genuine caring about the questions under examination. These weren't academic exercises, but urgent inquiries into how human beings should live. Plato believed that understanding the eternal forms, especially the form of the good, was the key to both individual happiness and social harmony. As the Academy continued its work year after year, it attracted some of the most brilliant minds of the ancient world. Students came from as far away as Sicily and Egypt, drawn by reports of the extraordinary education available in Plato's grove. They stayed for years, sometimes decades, participating in an ongoing conversation about the deepest questions of human existence. One of these students would eventually become even more famous than his teacher. His name was Aristotle, and he would study at the Academy for 20 years before developing his own revolutionary approaches to philosophy and science. But that's a story for another peaceful evening, when we can explore how the student's questions would eventually transform and challenge everything his master had taught. For now, as you settle deeper into the comfort of your bed, let Plato's vision of eternal forms drift through your consciousness like moonlight through olive leaves. Imagine a realm beyond the changing, imperfect world of everyday experience, a realm where beauty itself, justice itself, truth itself exist in perfect, unchanging glory. And perhaps, in the peaceful moments between waking and sleep, you might catch glimpses of those eternal patterns that Plato believed were the true foundation of all reality. Let your mind wander now from the sacred olive grove of Plato's Academy to the court of Macedonia, where around 384 BCE, in the mountain town of Stagira, a child was born who would grow up to organize all human knowledge into a vast, interconnected system. His father was court physician to King Amyntas II, which meant young Aristotle grew up surrounded by the practical sciences, anatomy, medicine, even as his brilliant mind hungered for the theoretical questions that had captivated his philosophical predecessors. Picture Aristotle as a youth of 17, making the journey from Macedonia to Athens to study at Plato's Academy. The trip would have taken weeks, following ancient roads that wound through mountain passes and across fertile plains where farmers tended olive groves and vineyards. Perhaps he traveled with a small caravan for safety, his few possessions packed in leather bags slung across a patient mule. his mind already buzzing with questions about everything he encountered along the way. Unlike Plato, who had the aristocratic bearing of someone born to Athens's elite families, Aristotle arrived as something of an outsider, provincial youth with a slight speech impediment and an intensity that some found off-putting. But his mind was like a vast library waiting to be filled, with an almost supernatural ability to absorb, analyze, and systematize information. Where Socrates asked questions and Plato constructed grand theories, Aristotle would spend his life carefully observing, categorizing, and explaining the intricate mechanisms of reality itself. Imagine encountering Aristotle during his 20 years as a student and then junior colleague at the academy. You might have found him in the morning, bent over a table in the shade of an olive tree, surrounded by wax tablets covered in careful notes. His kitten would be ink-stained from his constant writing, his hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it while thinking. Unlike other students who might spend their mornings in athletic training, Aristotle would be dissecting flowers to understand their structure, or sketching the anatomy of fish brought fresh from the harbor, or working out logical problems with the same methodical precision a craftsman uses to build furniture. The relationship between Aristotle and his teacher, Plato, was complex and beautiful in the way that relationships between intellectual giants often are. Plato, now in his 60s, had developed his theory of eternal forms and was convinced that true knowledge lay in turning away from the changing physical world toward unchanging mathematical and philosophical truths. But Aristotle, with his physician's training and naturalist's curiosity, couldn't help being fascinated by the physical world itself. Picture one of their conversations taking place on a warm afternoon in the Academy's garden. Plato, gesturing toward a rose blooming nearby, might explain how this particular flower was beautiful only because it participated in the eternal form of beauty, which existed in a realm beyond physical reality. But Aristotle would be examining the rose itself, counting its petals, noting the precise arrangement of leaves, observing how bees interacted with its pollen, and wondering about the mechanisms that allowed it to grow and reproduce. But teacher, Aristotle might have said with the respectful persistence that characterized all his questions, if the form of beauty exists separately from beautiful things, how does it make this rose beautiful? What is the connection between the eternal realm and this world where we actually live and love and make our choices? This wasn't mere intellectual rebelliousness. Aristotle genuinely respected his teacher and would later call Plato the man whom bad men have not even the right to praise. But his mind worked differently, and over the years at the academy, he began developing approaches to philosophy that would eventually revolutionize human understanding of logic, ethics, politics, biology, and virtually every other domain of knowledge. When Plato died in 347 BCE, Aristotle was passed over as head of the academy, perhaps because his views had diverged too much from orthodox Platonism. So he left Athens and spent several years traveling and conducting research, including a fascinating period on the island of Lesbos, where he studied marine biology with an intensity that would make modern scientists envious. Imagine Aristotle wading in tide pools at dawn, the Aegean Sea lapping gently at his sandaled feet, while he carefully observed sea urchins and starfish and the tiny creatures that lived among the rocks. He was one of the first people in history to study marine life systematically, and his observations were so accurate that they weren't improved upon until the development of modern biology 2,000 years later. He discovered that dolphins were mammals, not fish. He correctly described the reproduction of sharks and rays. He catalogued over 500 different animal species with a precision that still impresses zoologists today. But this wasn't just idle curiosity. Aristotle was developing a completely new way of understanding reality, one that didn't require escaping to a realm of eternal forms, but found profound patterns and purposes within the natural world itself. Where Plato saw the physical world as a pale shadow of true reality, Aristotle saw it as the only reality we have, but one so intricate and purposeful that studying it carefully could reveal the deepest truths about existence. In 335 BCE, Aristotle returned to Athens and established his own school, the Lyceum, in another sacred grove just outside the city walls. Unlike the academy, with its focus on mathematics and dialectical philosophy, the Lyceum became the world's first research university, a place where systematic investigation of every aspect of reality was not just encouraged, but organized into collaborative, scholarly projects. Picture the Lyceum in its heyday, a complex of buildings surrounded by gardens, where specimens of plants from all over the Mediterranean world grew in carefully tended plots. There would be a library containing hundreds of scrolls, the works of previous philosophers, but also historical chronicles, geographical accounts, collections of poetry, and scientific treatises. Students and teachers moved between different areas according to their interests. Budding biologists examining plant specimens in one garden, future political theorists analyzing constitutions from different Greek cities in another area, logicians working out the formal rules of valid reasoning in shaded colonnades could pace back and forth while thinking. The school got its nickname from this habit of walking while discussing philosophy. They were called the walking around philosophers. Imagine joining one of these walking discussions on a morning when spring was turning to summer and the air was fragrant with blooming jasmine. Aristotle, now in his 40s and at the height of his intellectual powers, would set a measured pace along the garden paths while students gathered around him, some walking alongside, others trailing behind, all hanging on every word as the master explained his latest insights into the nature of causation or the structure of logical arguments. What made Aristotle's teaching so revolutionary was his systematic approach to every subject. Where previous philosophers had offered brilliant insights scattered across various topics, Aristotle created comprehensive frameworks that could organize all human knowledge. He invented formal logic, the rules for valid reasoning that are still taught in philosophy courses today. He developed the first systematic approach to ethics, politics, and rhetoric. He created detailed taxonomies for biology that anticipated modern classification systems. But perhaps most importantly, Aristotle developed a way of understanding causation that made sense of why things happen in the natural world. He identified 4 different types of causes operating in any natural process. Take a simple example: an acorn growing into an oak tree. The material cause is the physical stuff, the cells and tissues. The formal cause is the pattern or structure that makes it specifically an oak rather than some other kind of plant. The efficient cause is the triggering mechanisms, sunlight, water, nutrients that stimulate growth. And the final cause is the purpose or goal toward which the process naturally tends, becoming a mature oak tree capable of producing more acorns. This fourfold analysis could be applied to human actions as well. Consider a potter making a vase. The clay is the material cause. The design in the potter's mind is the formal cause. The potter's skill and movements are the efficient cause. And the purpose, creating a vessel for holding flowers or wine, is the final cause. What made this analysis so powerful was that it showed how purpose and meaning were built into the very structure of reality, not imposed on it from some external realm of forms. Picture Aristotle explaining this theory to a group of students on one of those perfect Mediterranean evenings when the air seems to hold light like honey. They might be sitting in the Lyceum's garden amphitheater, a natural depression surrounded by stone benches where larger groups could gather for lectures. As the sun set behind the olive trees and oil lamps were lit to continue the discussion, Aristotle would use examples from everyday experience to show how his theory illuminated everything from the growth of plants to the decisions of statesmen to the creation of works of art. What made these discussions so engaging was Aristotle's genius for seeing connections between apparently unrelated phenomena. The same principles that governed the development of embryos also applied to the formation of good character in human beings. The logic that structured valid arguments was related to the patterns found in poetry and rhetoric. The study of animal behavior could illuminate questions about human politics and ethics. This interconnectedness wasn't just intellectual cleverness, it reflected Aristotle's deep conviction that reality itself was unified and purposeful. Unlike some modern thinkers who see the universe as a collection of random particles bouncing around according to mechanical laws, Aristotle saw nature as more like a vast organism, with each part playing its role in maintaining the health and purpose of the whole. One of the most beautiful expressions of this vision was Aristotle's approach to ethics. Where Plato had argued that virtue came from understanding eternal forms, Aristotle grounded ethics in careful observation of human nature and human flourishing. He noticed that people seemed to be happiest and most fulfilled when they developed their distinctively human capacities: friendship, aesthetic appreciation, political participation to their highest potential. This led to his famous doctrine of the golden mean, the idea that moral virtue typically involves finding the right balance between extremes. Courage, for instance, is the mean between cowardice to little boldness and recklessness to much boldness. Generosity lies between stinginess and wasteful spending. Wit is the mean between humorlessness and clownish excess. Imagine Aristotle discussing this theory with his students as they walked through the Lyceum's gardens on an autumn afternoon. The leaves would be turning golden and brown, creating a natural lesson in the beauty of balance and seasonal change. Look around you, he might say, gesturing to the perfectly proportioned olive trees and the carefully cultivated flower beds. Nature itself teaches us about the excellence that comes from proper measure and balance. The gardener who waters too little kills his plants through neglect. The one who waters too much kills them through excess. Virtue in human character works the same way. What made Aristotle's ethical theory so practical and appealing was that it didn't require people to be philosophical saints. You didn't need to escape the physical world or achieve mystical union with eternal forms to live a good life. You just needed to develop your human capacities thoughtfully and find appropriate balances in your responses to life's challenges and opportunities. This practical wisdom extended to Aristotle's political philosophy as well, where Plato had imagined an ideal republic ruled by Aristotle studied actual constitutions from 158 different Greek cities to understand what made governments work well or poorly in practice. He concluded that the best practical government was usually a mixed system, balanced the interests of different social classes, and prevented any single group from accumulating too much power. As we leave Aristotle there in his beloved Lyceum, surrounded by students and scrolls and carefully catalogued specimens from across the known world, surrounded by the gentle sounds of evening settling over Athens, the distant call of merchants closing their shops, the soft murmur of scholarly conversations continuing into the night, the whisper of styluses scratching notes onto wax tablets. Let his vision of systematic understanding settle over your thoughts like a warm blanket in a world that sometimes seems chaotic and meaningless. There's something deeply comforting about Aristotle's conviction that reality has structure and purpose, that careful observation and clear thinking can reveal the patterns and principles that govern everything from the smallest insect to the largest questions of human meaning and value. And perhaps, as you drift toward sleep, you might find peace in the thought that you too are part of that great purposeful system, with your own unique capacities to develop and your own distinctive role to play in the grand symphony of existence. As our journey through the philosophical groves of ancient Greece draws toward its gentle close, let your thoughts drift like evening incense from Aristotle's systematic Lyceum to a more intimate gathering place, a garden on the outskirts of Athens, where, around 306 BCE, a philosopher named Epicurus created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a community dedicated not to abstract theoretical knowledge, but to the practical art of living well and finding genuine contentment. Picture this: while other philosophical schools competed to unravel the deepest mysteries of existence, Epicurus simply asked a more personal question. What does it actually take for a human being to be happy? Not temporarily pleased or momentarily excited, but deeply, sustainably happy in a way that could weather life's inevitable storms and uncertainties. The Garden of Epicurus, for that's what his school was, called, wasn't grand like Plato's Academy or organized like Aristotle's Lyceum. Instead, imagine a modest villa surrounded by vegetable plots and fruit trees, where the scent of ripening figs mingled with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil. Here, philosophy wasn't an abstract intellectual exercise, but a form of medicine for the soul, designed to cure the anxiety, fear, and restless craving that seemed to plague most human lives. Epicurus himself was a fascinating figure, born on the island of Samos around 341 BC, just 3 years after Aristotle founded the Lyceum. But where Aristotle had been a systematic scholar and Plato a grand theorist, Epicurus possessed what we might call the gentlest form of revolutionary wisdom. He was like a physician who specialized in treating diseases of the spirit, and his prescription was startlingly simple. Pay attention to what actually makes you happy, not what others tell you should make you happy. Imagine encountering Epicurus on a typical morning in his garden. You might find him sitting under a pomegranate tree heavy with fruit, perhaps sharing a simple breakfast of bread, olives, and goat cheese with a small group of friends and students. The morning air would be cool and sweet, carrying the sound of bees working among the flowering herbs that grew in abundance throughout the garden's peaceful pathways. What would strike you immediately about Epicurus was his ordinariness. Unlike the intimidating intellectual brilliance of Plato or the encyclopedic systematizing of Aristotle, Epicurus seemed like someone you might meet in any neighborhood, friendly, thoughtful, genuinely interested in your well-being, with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from paying careful attention to the simple realities of daily life. Tell me, he might say, offering you a piece of perfectly ripe fruit, what made you happy yesterday? Not what you think should have made you happy, but what actually did bring you joy, even for a moment. This question, so simple it almost seems naive, was actually the foundation of a philosophical revolution. Epicurus had noticed that most people spent their lives chasing things they believed would make them happy: wealth, fame, power, exotic pleasures, while ignoring the simple satisfactions that were readily available: friendship, good food, comfortable shelter, freedom from pain and anxiety. The garden operated on principles that would have seemed scandalous to most ancient Greek institutions. Women were welcomed as equals, not just as students, but as teachers and full participants in the philosophical community. Slaves could join and were treated with the same respect as free citizens. The community was financially supported not by wealthy patrons seeking intellectual prestige, but by the modest contributions of members who had discovered that sharing resources made everyone's life more secure and pleasant. Picture the daily rhythm of life in the garden during its golden years. Mornings might begin with simple communal breakfasts, where friends gathered to share food and conversation. Unlike the formal dialogues of other schools, these discussions flowed naturally from practical concerns. How do you handle anxiety about the future? What's the difference between necessary desires and empty cravings? How can you maintain equanimity when dealing with difficult people or disappointing circumstances? Epicurus had developed what he called the tetrapharmakos, the fourfold medicine for human unhappiness. First, don't fear the gods, because they exist in perfect bliss and have no reason to interfere in human affairs. Second, don't fear death, because it's simply the absence of sensation you can't suffer when you don't exist. Third, recognize that genuine pleasure is easy to attain. It consists mainly in the absence of pain and anxiety, plus simple satisfactions like food when hungry, rest when tired, companionship when lonely. Fourth, understand that pain is either brief or bearable intense. Pain doesn't last long, and chronic pain can be endured with the right mental attitude. These might sound like platitudes until you imagine them being lived out in the daily practices of the garden community. Consider how revolutionary it was, in a culture dominated by elaborate religious rituals and constant anxiety about offending various gods, to suggest that the divine realm was simply indifferent to human affairs, not hostile, just uninvolved, like distant stars that shine beautifully but don't interfere with earthly weather. Patterns, or think about the practical implications of not fearing death. This didn't mean being reckless or failing to take reasonable precautions. Rather, it meant not spending your precious living moments consumed by anxiety about something that, by definition, you'll never actually experience. As Epicurus put it in one of his most famous observations, death is nothing to us. When we are, death has not yet come, and when death has come, we are not. Picture a typical evening in the garden as summer slowly faded toward autumn. The community would gather for their main meal of the day, simple food prepared communally and shared with the kind of attention that transforms eating from mere fuel consumption into a form of celebration. The menu might include fresh bread, still warm from the oven, olives and cheese, seasonal vegetables from their own plots, perhaps a modest cup of wine mixed with water in the Greek fashion, but the real nourishment came from the conversation and companionship. Unlike the competitive intellectual discourse common in other philosophical schools, garden discussions focused on mutual support and practical wisdom. Someone might share a worry about aging parents, and the group would explore together how Epicurean principles could offer comfort and guidance. Another person might describe a conflict with neighbors, leading to a gentle exploration of how to maintain inner tranquility even when dealing with unreasonable people. What made these conversations so healing was their foundation in genuine care for each person's well-being. Epicurus had discovered that intellectual cleverness, while entertaining, wasn't nearly as valuable as the kind of wisdom that actually helped people live better lives. His garden became famous throughout the ancient world, not for producing brilliant treatises or training future political leaders, but for the simple fact that people who spent time there seemed to become notably happier, calmer, and more content. This practical focus led Epicurus to develop surprisingly modern insights about pleasure and desire. He noticed that many of the things people craved most intensely, luxury status, exotic experiences, actually produced less satisfaction than simpler pleasures that were readily available. A perfectly ripe piece of fruit eaten when hungry might bring more genuine pleasure than an elaborate feast consumed out of social obligation. An afternoon spent in easy conversation with friends might be more satisfying than attendance at the most prestigious social gatherings. Epicurus systematically analyzed different types of desires to help his students distinguish between those worth pursuing and those likely to cause more trouble than satisfaction. Natural and necessary desires for food, shelter, friendship were worth fulfilling because they led to genuine contentment. Natural but unnecessary desires for luxury, fame, immortality could be enjoyed if they came naturally but weren't worth obsessing over. Vain desires for things that were literally impossible or inherently contradictory best recognized and gently released. Imagine applying this analysis to your own life as you settle deeper into the comfort of your bed tonight. What are you genuinely hungry for in the deepest sense? What would actually nourish your spirit, as opposed to what you've been told should make you happy? There's something wonderfully restful about Epicurus's insight that genuine satisfaction is usually simpler and more accessible than we imagine. The garden's approach to friendship was perhaps its most beautiful contribution to human wisdom. Epicurus famously declared that friendship dances around the world, proclaiming to all of us that we must wake up to the recognition of happiness. He had observed that people who cultivated deep, supportive friendships were consistently happier than those who pursued wealth, power, or fame without such connections. But garden friendship wasn't based on shared interests or social convenience. It was grounded in mutual commitment to each other's flourishing. Friends in the garden made themselves available during difficult times, celebrated each other's successes without envy, and created the kind of emotional security that allowed everyone to relax into their authentic selves. Picture one of the garden's legendary friendship rituals: the monthly feast where community members would gather not just to share food, but to explicitly appreciate each other. Unlike modern dinner parties focused on entertainment or networking, these gatherings had the sacred quality of communion, where people took turns expressing gratitude for the specific ways their friends had enriched their lives. As Epicurus aged, he lived to the remarkable age of 71. Dying peacefully in 270 BC, the garden continued to embody his vision of philosophy as a form of therapy for the human condition. Students came not to master abstract theories, but to learn practical skills for managing anxiety, cultivating contentment, and creating meaningful relationships. His final letter, written to his friend Idomeneus on the day of his death, perfectly captures the spirit that animated his entire philosophical project. I write this to you on the happiest and the last day of my life. I am suffering from diseases of the bladder and stomach, which could not possibly be surpassed in intensity. But there is marshaled against all these sufferings the joy in my soul produced by the memory of our conversations together. Here was a man dying in considerable physical pain who could still describe his final day as happy because he had learned to find profound satisfaction in the simple reality of loving friendship and shared wisdom. His pain was real and acknowledged, but it didn't define his experience because he had cultivated inner resources that no external circumstance could touch. As we leave Epicurus there in his beloved garden, surrounded by fruit trees and vegetable plots, and the gentle murmur of friends caring for each other, let his vision of attainable happiness settle over your evening thoughts like the softest blanket. In our age of endless stimulation and complicated desires, there's something deeply peaceful about his insight that contentment might be simpler than we imagine, as close as the next breath, the next kind word, the next moment of genuine appreciation for life's readily available gifts. Perhaps tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might experiment with Epicurean attention to simple pleasures: the comfort of your bed, the peacefulness of your room, the satisfaction of having spent another day learning and growing and connecting with others. And maybe, in those drowsy moments between waking and sleep, you'll catch a glimpse of what Epicurus discovered in his garden: that happiness isn't a distant goal to be achieved, but a gentle awareness to be cultivated, available in any moment when we remember to receive life's quiet gifts with gratitude and grace. And so, dear friends, our gentle journey through the marble halls and olive groves of ancient Greek philosophy draws to its peaceful close. We've wandered together from Thales gazing at stars over Miletus harbor to Epicurus sharing simple meals with beloved friends in his garden of contentment. We've listened to Socrates asking his eternally curious questions in the Athenian agora, followed Plato into his cave of dancing shadows and eternal forms, walked with Aristotle through his systematic exploration of everything that exists, and finally found rest in the practical wisdom of Epicurus's philosophy of attainable happiness. These ancient voices still whisper to us across 25 centuries, offering not dusty academic theories, but living wisdom for the timeless human challenges of finding meaning, creating justice, understanding our place in the cosmos, and learning the gentle art of being content. Their questions remain our questions. Their wonder still kindles our curiosity. Their search for wisdom continues in every thoughtful moment of our own lives. May these memories of philosophical friendship and intellectual courage guide you into the most peaceful of dreams tonight. And if this quiet journey has helped you drift toward restful sleep, or if these ancient stories have sparked new questions in your own seeking mind, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Where in the world are you listening tonight? Which of these philosophical friends spoke most clearly to your heart? Sweet dreams, gentle seekers. Until we meet again in another corner of history's vast library, may you find wisdom in questions, peace in uncertainty, and joy in the simple miracle of consciousness, contemplating itself under the same stars that guided our ancient Greek companions on their eternal quest for truth. Sleep well, friends. Sleep well.